Part 3 of our ecology lecture deals with ecosystems. I also don't have very much time, so this is going to be pretty quick and will end when the bell rings. So ecologists have long recognized that there are global and regional patterns that regulate the distribution of organisms within the biosphere. And they consider multiple factors when they try to explain the distribution of species. Here we have an illustration of wombat distribution in Australia, and what you can see is that there are different types of wombats that live in different particular areas. Ecologists will look at two different types of factors, both biotic and abiotic. The definition of dispersal is movement of individuals away from centers of high population to areas from their area of origin. So a good example of dispersal is if you take one of those dandelion flowers that have seeded and you blow on it and they go all over, that is a dispersal. It contributes to global distribution of organisms, and there are a lot of things that influence the dispersal or distribution of organisms. Here we're looking at a flow chart of factors that limit geographic distribution. So if you're wondering why is there a particular species that's absent from an area, the first question to ask is, does dispersal limit its distribution? If no, then you wonder if behavior limits its distribution. If so, then you could think that it's habitat selection that is causing them. If not, then you would look at other biotic factors like other species limiting its distribution. If you can't find, so if the answer to that is yes, then you're thinking about predators or competition. If no, then that's when you would start to look at abiotic factors. And abiotic factors can be chemical, water, oxygen, pH, but they can also be physical, temperature, light, fire, moisture, etc. So another example of dispersal and how it can change over time is here with the cattle egret. You can see that it started in the 1930s in South America, and you can watch the progression of the egret over time to its current location, which is up towards Canada. So again, I mentioned that there are biotic and abiotic factors that influence dispersion and distribution. Biotic factors are interactions with other species, specifically predation and competition. Abiotic factors affecting the distribution of organisms include temperature. So if environmental temperature is an important factor in the distribution of organisms, it would be likely because it will affect its biological processes. So they can't get too cold because cells would freeze, can't get too hot because proteins will denature. So there's a lot of things come into play when it comes to temperature. Also, another example is both mammals and birds will expend a lot of energy trying to regulate their internal temperature. So they need to be somewhere where they don't have to waste too much energy. Water availability and habitats is another important factor in species distribution. For example, desert organisms will exhibit adaptations for water conservation. Sun, you can think about light and intensity affecting photosynthesis. Rocks and soil are also considered abiotic factors, and these will vary both in space and in time. Four major abiotic components of climate that we just talked about: temperature, water, sunlight, and also wind. The long-term prevailing weather conditions is what we consider its climate. So climate has to deal with weather patterns over a long period of time. Macroclimate is the patterns on a global or regional level. Microclimate is very fine patterns in a particular community. Long-term climate change is not something we'll spend too much time talking about. It's important that you guys are understanding the global climate will profoundly affect the biosphere. We can look at previous weather changes and make predictions on what might happen in the future. Some examples we can look at is what happened after the glaciers began retreating 16,000 years ago and how that affected the distribution of trees. And then as climate changes, species that have difficulty dispersing might not be able to adapt and would then become extinct. There are a lot of different biomes. Biomes are the major ecological associations that occupy larger regions of land. They're diverse and dynamic, and they cover most of Earth. And they have a lot of different combinations of both those biotic and abiotic factors that really determine the nature of them. So there are aquatic biomes. Major aquatic biomes are typically characterized by their physical, chemical, geological environment, and also the organisms that live within them. They can contain fresh or salt water, and they account for the largest part of the biosphere of Earth. So here we're looking at an illustration of all of these aquatic biomes. There's different types. You can have lakes, and again, there's different types of lakes. Here are a couple examples. You can have oligotrophic lakes, which are nutrient poor but oxygen rich. You can have eutrophic lakes, which are nutrient rich, and typically have a lot of aquatic plants living there. There's also wetlands. Wetlands are, interestingly, among the most productive biomes on Earth, home to very diverse invertebrates and birds. There's streams and rivers, estuaries. Estuary is a transition area between river and sea, and this salinity will vary depending upon the rise and fall of the tides. They are super interesting. There's also intertidal zones. These are areas that are periodically submerged and exposed by the tides. Intertidal organisms are really cool as well. They're challenged by variations in both temperature and salinity, and also the actual mechanical force of the waves. So they really have to have structural adaptations to enable to attach to hard surfaces like the sea stars you see there. Terrestrial biomes are also very interesting. Climate has the greatest impact on the distribution of organisms within a terrestrial biome. Typically, these are illustrated by a climograph, which I'll show you in the next slide, and that's a plot of temperature and precipitation in a given region. Biomes are affected not just by the temperature and precipitation, but also by the pattern in temperature, the pattern of the temperature and precipitation throughout the year. So here is a climograph for some of the major types of biomes in North America. Climate is important when you're looking at terrestrial biomes. They are found in certain areas. They can be modified by disturbances such as storms, fire, and human activity. You can see here again in the picture we have the temperature and precipitation, and the type of biome is really dictated by those two factors. So tropical forest, temperate grassland, all of these different types, again, pretty much characterized by precipitation and temperature. Terrestrial biomes, other than precipitation and temperature, are also characterized a lot by the plants and animals that live in it. They also tend to grade into each other, meaning they overlap somewhat. There's not like a super sharp boundary where you can say, okay, I'm entering into this particular type of biome. We call that area an ecotone. So that's the area where they somewhat overlap, and that can be wide or narrow. Tropical forests are often characterized by the greatest diversity of species. They occur near the equator. One of the major characteristics of a tropical forest is their seasonality. So they don't have winter. They typically have rain and dry. Those are the two seasons. Also, interestingly, the length of daylight does not vary. It's typically 12 hours throughout the year. Deserts cover about 1/5 of the Earth's surface. They occur where the rainfall is less than 50 centimeters per year. Most of the deserts, like the Sahara in North Africa, occur at low latitudes, but there are cold deserts that occur in other areas. There are relatively few large mammals that occur in deserts because they're really not capable of storing sufficient water and withstanding the heat. Deserts typically provide very little shelter for large animals. So the mammals that are there are typically small, like kangaroo mice, which you would find in the North American desert. In a savanna, the precipitation and temperature are seasonal. Grasses and forbs make up most of the ground cover. Common inhabitants include insects and mammals like wildebeest, zebras, lions, and hyenas. Temperate grasslands are found on many continents. The winters are cold and dry. The summers are wet and hot. Mammals would be large grazers and some small burrowers. A temperate forest, winters are cool, summers are hot and humid. Significant precipitation will fall, rain and snow. Mammals would include birds, insects, and also vertical layers in the forest of different types of birds. In the northern hemisphere, many of the mammals will hibernate in the winter. The tundra covers expansive areas. In the Arctic, alpine tundra exists on high mountaintops at all latitudes. Winters are long and cold. Summers are relatively cool. Precipitation will vary. Tundras also will include a permafrost, which is a permanently frozen layer of soil, which prevents the water from getting in. Typically, you'll see birds, grazers, and also their predators. So those were the major types of biomes. The final thing to discuss in the ecosystem ecology area is trophic levels. So here we're looking at an illustration of energy flow throughout an ecosystem. You have producers, and you can see that the energy starts pretty high, around 1,000 kilocalories. Once you move up to primary consumers, you go down by 10%, so you have 100 kilocalories. So primary consumers eat the producers. You've got the secondary consumers that eat the primary consumers, and then the tertiary consumers that eat the secondary consumers. And again, you can see that the energy flow decreases by about 10% every time. There are also different ways to illustrate it. So you can have an ecological pyramid that is illustrating that same effect, or you could have a food web, which shows the interactions of different organisms. The food chain here is a simple one thing from one thing. It's a single line, whereas a food web will branch out in all directions. It's much more complex, and it'll show many connected food chains. Both of them will tell us what happens in an ecosystem. So again, food chain is one thing to one thing, where a food web is typically many connected food chains. There are different types of ecological pyramids. We just talked about the energy pyramid, which was the amount of energy at each level. There's also a biomass pyramid, which is the mass of biological material at every level, and also a number pyramid, which is the number of organisms at each trophic level. But in general, the same rules apply, the 10% rule in general. Nutrient cycling is another thing that becomes really important when it comes to ecosystems. Plants need nutrients from the soil to grow, just like people need food. Soil nutrients mostly come from the breakdown of rocks and organic matter, which comes from the decomposition of plants and animals. The nutrients that the plants get from the soil are stored in the plant tissues, like the leaves, stems, and flowers. When the tissues fall to the ground, they break down, and together with decomposing insects and dead animals, they eventually are reincorporated into the soil by rainfall and earthworms. So the organic matter is further broken down and slowly transformed to become nutrients that are available to growing plants, and then the cycle continues. Carbon cycle. Here we have plants and other producers extract the CO2 from the atmosphere using energy from the sun and convert it into sugar. Then the producers and consumers use the sugar from the carbon as a source of energy. The carbon will then move through the food chain. It will be released back into the atmosphere through respiration. What's not exhaled will accumulate in the ground when organisms die and decompose. Once carbon is in the ground, it leaves the carbon cycle forever. However, there is an exception when humans extract it in the form of oil and coal and natural gas and release it back into the atmosphere by burning it. The end point here is that without carbon, producers would not have any way to use energy from the sun. So carbon is incredibly important. You also have a water cycle. Water is an important resource, any component to any ecosystem. All living organisms need water to survive. And in the ecosystem, water cycles through atmosphere, soil, rivers, lakes, and oceans. So water is incredibly important. There's also a nitrogen cycle. Even though organisms use nitrogen less than they use carbon or water, it could also be said that a lack of nitrogen would eradicate life on Earth. Most of the nitrogen in the world is found in the atmosphere. However, most organisms on Earth are not able to use atmospheric nitrogen directly. In order for nitrogen to enter the community, it must first be converted into a usable form by special nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the soil. The bacteria often live close to plants who can take that fixed nitrogen and incorporate it into their proteins. And then the cycle is somewhat like the carbon cycle, where it becomes incorporated into plants, animals eat the plants, and etc. The last important chemical cycle in an ecosystem is phosphorus. Phosphorus is an essential chemical that's used by organisms in one of the main components of DNA. Most of the phosphorus on Earth is stored in soil and rocks in the forms of phosphate. Plants can absorb phosphate directly into their roots, and then from there, it's typical fashion. Animals eat the plants, and etc. Eutrophication, I just wanted to mention, especially since we have some of this going on in some of the lakes in the area. It's an enrichment of an ecosystem with chemical nutrients, typically nitrogen and phosphorus. It can be found, it's a natural process in lakes occurring as they age through geologic time. It's typically thought of as a pollution problem, and human activities can accelerate the rate in which nutrients enter the system. A big one is runoff from agriculture and development. Also, pollution from septic system and sewers and other human activities can influence the amount of nutrients that are getting into water. And basically what happens is the nutrients cause an increase in aquatic plant growth, and so then you end up with something like an algae bloom, and that then blocks the sunlight from getting down to the plants at the bottom. Those plants die and decay. It leads to a loss of food, habitat, and oxygen production within a lake. Here's a couple examples of that. Human impacts is, okay, the bell's about to ring in like 30 seconds, so I'm going to have to stop here. So I will do a small video on human impacts later.